Hello, I'm Professor Alex Watson, and I'm a historian at Goldsmiths, University of London. And this headline lecture is on Why Did Germans Vote for Hitler? What I'm going to do in this short recording is set the scene, explain to you why this is such an exciting topic, and give you some key themes and ideas that I want you to think about in preparation for our webinar on this topic on Wednesday, 20th of October, 2021. And I'm really looking forward to talking this through with you then and seeing what ideas you've got and what your responses are. I share my screen and open my PowerPoint. We can start on the 30th of January 1933, a truly epoch-making moment, the day that Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. Now, this was the beginnings of the Nazi regime, a regime which would very quickly imprison or kill its opponents and seize total power in Germany, a regime which would rearm the country and launch a Second World War, and a regime which would murder most of Europe's Jewish population, some 6 million people. And when that regime finally died in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, it left Germany, and with it most of Europe, in ruins. And this is where it all begins, 30th of January 1933, Hitler becoming Chancellor. Now, Hitler wasn't elected Chancellor. His party, the Nazi Party, never won a majority of the German vote in Parliament, in the Reichstag, as the German Parliament was called. In fact, no party in the interwar German democracy ever won a full majority. The constitution of the democracy, the so-called Weimar Constitution, was deliberately designed to avoid big majorities being won by one party. Instead, it was set up so that the parliamentary system would reflect the varying different political shades across the nation. Hitler was appointed, and he was appointed by the president, the former First World War General Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, on the advice of Hindenburg's conservative and authoritarian allies. But Hindenburg reached out for Hitler precisely because Hitler had a mass following. By January 1933, Hitler's Nazi Party was the largest party in Germany's Parliament, winning millions and millions of voters. And Hindenburg desperately needed a politician with mass support who could break the political deadlock that after years of crisis, Germany found itself in. So there's a direct relationship between the Nazis' electoral success and Hitler's appointment as Chancellor. Without those electoral victories, there would have been no Nazi regime. And that's why historians have found this so fascinating. It's a really exciting story as well. It's an extraordinary story of a meteoric rise of a small party on the lunatic right fringes of German politics through to becoming, within 4 years, the largest party in Germany, the largest political force in Germany. And you can see that from this graph here. In May 28, the Nazis were polling around 800,000 votes, just 2.63% of all those cast. Yet September 1930, they have a big boost. They become the second largest party in the parliament with 18% of the vote. And 2 years later, they double that vote to nearly 14 million, getting 37.76%. Huge percentage of the German population supporting the Nazi Party. And historians have tried to explain how on earth the Nazis managed it, from obscurity to the main political force in Germany. Just extraordinary. And of course, being historians, we've identified key historical episodes without which you can't really understand the Nazi rise. And the foundational one, without any doubt, is the First World War, the Great War of 1914 to 1918. Now, that war cast a shadow across interwar German democracy. The memory of the 2 million German soldiers who died in it, the humiliation of defeat in 1918, and the continued bitterness of the reparations that Germany was forced to pay the victors and of the territorial losses that it had suffered rubbed away at German democracy and was a key part of German political debate and anger right through this period. The revolution, which had followed defeat in 1918-1919, had not by any means been welcomed by all Germans, and many Germans had at most a conditional loyalty to democracy in the interwar period. Another key legacy of the First World War was the experience of mass military mobilization and mass violence. And you can see that in this image, in the military-style uniforms and postures that Hitler and his political paramilitaries, the stormtroops, are wearing. And it was visible too in the violence in the streets which accompanied every single election in Weimar Germany in the late 1920s onwards. The problem with simply focusing on the First World War, though, is of course that it ended in 1918, nearly 15 years before Hitler is appointed as Chancellor, and a decade before Hitler and his Nazi Party begin to gain support in the polls. So there is a connection between the war and the Nazi Party and the Nazi regime, but it's a complex one. It's not a direct one. So historians have searched further, looked for something a bit more proximate, a bit more recent, tied to Nazi success. And of course, they've come up with the Great Depression of October 1929. The Wall Street crash in New York in October 29 started a financial crisis which spread right across the world and which hit Germany particularly hard. By 1932, 40% of the German workforce, some 6 million people, were unemployed. Just simply staggering. And the picture that I've got up here of this unemployed worker, I'm hungry, seek work, will do anything, really encapsulates in one image the desperation felt by these people. If you take a look at the graph, you can see instantly that there is a connection between unemployment and the rise of the Nazis. The Nazi Party vote starts rising after the Great Crash, when unemployment starts rising. And as unemployment rises, the Nazi vote gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But again, it's a complex relationship, and we see that if we dig down a little, because it's not the unemployed who are voting for the Nazis. If you look at electoral district data, so what's going on in the different electoral districts that made up Germany, what you find is that the more unemployed there are in any district, the lower the Nazi vote. We've got a bit of a paradox here, a bit of a problem. On one hand, clearly, as the graph shows, as unemployment rises, the Nazi Party vote is rising. But on the other hand, the district level data shows that it's clearly not the unemployed who are voting for the Nazis, it's other people. Unemployed tend to vote for the Nazis' arch enemies, the communists. So what's going on? How do we explain the Nazi rise? Why did Germans vote for Hitler? And I think to answer that question, we need to ask another kind of sub-question. First, as a preliminary step, who voted for the Nazis? Because, of course, not all Germans did vote for the Nazis. Many Germans didn't. And I like this image that I've got on the screen now, because I think it says a couple of things about the end of the Weimar Republic and democracy in interwar Germany. First thing is it shows the sheer range of options that Germans had. Germans were not short of political options, of political parties to vote for in the early 1930s. You've got the Nazis closest to the camera, the National Socialists, but next to them, the man in the suit, you've got an advert for the German Catholic Centre Party. Next to him is a social democratic activist. Social Democratic Party was the democratic mainstay of the Weimar system. And next to him, the Nazis' enemies, a communist. Beyond that, there's a conservative nationalist, and there were many, many other parties representing a range of different interest groups. So there was certainly no inevitability that Germans would vote for the Nazi Party. The other reason why I like this image is that I think it hints at something about political messaging, about what we often call propaganda, about parties' self-image. How did the Nazi Party reach out to prospective voters? What was its message? How did it present itself? And those are questions that we'll be exploring in the webinar in October. And to drill down, to find out why some Germans were particularly likely to vote for the Nazis, we need to analyse more and think about who exactly voted for the Nazis. And for a long time, there were two main theories explaining the Nazi rise. The first was Seymour Martin Lipset's class analysis theory, which argued that Nazism is a manifestation of middle-class extremism, and that Nazism especially appealed to the needs of small farmers, to businesses and craftsmen who were under great distress in the capitalist crisis triggered by the Wall Street crash. And Lipset, in this class analysis theory and his follows, argue that middle-class voters were key in the Nazi rise. They were responsible for it. The Nazi movement was above all, they argue, a middle-class movement. The competing theory is Bendrix's mass society theory, and that doesn't see the middle class as being especially important. Instead, it takes German interwar society as a whole and argues that it was atomized, that individuals by themselves, that whole social groups were separated from each other, something that actually people worry about in our own society to a great degree as well. Bendrix argued that since 1914 there had been a series of crises which had ripped German society apart and ripped people from their previous, more traditional political loyalties. First World War, the hyperinflation that followed in the early 1920s and the Revolution, and then the Great Depression of the late 20s and early 30s had ripped apart older political bonds. And Bendrix and the followers of the mass society theory argued that the people who were key in the Nazi rise were former non-voters. The Nazis were uniquely able to mobilise people who before hadn't bothered to vote, or, because they were too young, hadn't been able to vote. And it was that ability to mobilise the politically alienated that fuelled the Nazis' rise. But since those two theories, there's been even more work done, and particularly Jürgen Falter, a German historian, has been key in undertaking really detailed statistical analysis of German voting. And his work has shown that, in fact, those two earlier theories, neither of them were right. They underestimate the complexity of both German voting and Nazi support. He argues, and he sees from his data, that both the middle classes and former non-voters were both important in causing that Nazi jump in electoral support in 1930. But he goes beyond this and argues that, in fact, the electoral coalition that was instrumental in bringing the Nazis to power was much broader than simply the middle classes or non-voters, and that it embraced a very wide range of Germans. It took Germans from all sorts of different walks of life in different parts of Germany, to the point at which he talks about the Nazi movement as being a people's party of protest. The very first party in Weimar Germany which was able to mobilise across class and other divisions within Germany. Let's look at what he says in more detail. He splits the Germans up into different categories of people, and three most important categories are by religion, by class, and by gender. Historians were surprised, not least because modern historians don't think enough about religion. That tends to be a medieval thing. We don't think about religion. It's not important in the modern world, but it really, really is. And it really was in interwar Germany. And it turns out that religion was the key voting variable, the key thing which determined whether someone was likely to vote Nazi or unlikely to vote Nazi. Catholics, in particular, were unwilling to vote Nazi. The Catholic Church was dead set against the Nazi Party in the late 20s and in the early 1930s. And Catholics had their own party, which had a long history stretching back before the rise of the Weimar democracy into the imperial pre-1914, pre-First World War period, called the Catholic Centre Party, and they tended to vote for that. And we can see that if we look at the statistics for the election of July 1932, when the Nazis were at peak popularity before Hitler becomes Chancellor, some 40% of German Protestants vote Nazi, but only 14% of Catholics vote for the Nazi Party. Second key variable, class. Class is also very important, and indeed it's true the middle classes dominated, or at least were the most significant group within the Nazi Party electorate. Numerically, the dominant people were small businessmen, craftsmen and farmers, often called the old middle classes. And they were numerically dominant because there were so many of them willing to vote for the Nazi Party. But in terms of the group among whom the Nazis were most popular, it was actually the upper middle classes, but there were fewer of them, so they were outnumbered by the small businessmen, craftsmen and farmers. Lower middle class and upper middle classes comprise together 60% of the Nazi electorate, so middle classes are indeed very, very important. But it turns out workers are much more important than was recognised before as well. Industrial workers who work in factories tend to support either the Social Democratic Party, the mainstay of Weimar democracy, or the communists. But other types of workers, workers in commerce, agricultural workers, were actually pretty keen on the Nazi Party, and some 40% of those voting for the Nazis in the early 1930s were of a working class origin. And this is why Falter talks about this People's Party of protest. It really allows that large working class constituency allows the Nazis to present themselves as a German unifying people's party. The other important characteristic is gender. Several contemporaries in Weimar blamed women for the rise of the Nazis. But actually, Falter's research shows that in fact, women were much less likely to vote Nazi, especially at first, than men. German women tended to vote more than men for conservative parties, but not for radical ones. And therefore, in 1930, the major first jump that the Nazis make, was driven by male voting, not by women. Only in July 1932 was voting roughly equal. Women are a really important constituency in the Weimar Republic, not least because they actually outnumber men. The Weimar electorate is disproportionately female. And you can think about why that should be. Why were there more women than men in the electorate in the early 1930s? You can tell me when I see you in October. I'll be interested to hear what you come up with. And that sets us up for the questions that I'd really like to explore with you in our upcoming webinar. The first question that I want you to think about is, why were some Germans more likely than others to vote for the Nazi Party in the early 1930s? So why were Protestant middle classes especially likely to vote Nazi? And why were German Catholics and industrial workers underrepresented among Nazi voters? That's a key question we've got to tackle if we're going to understand why these Germans voted for the Nazi Party, why they voted for Hitler. Second issue that I want you to think about is how important was the Great Depression in the Nazis' growing popularity. We've seen that the relationship is complicated. Is this simply a story of economics, or are political values behind this as well? Can we talk about a culture war in Germany in the 1930s, a war of values, perhaps analogous to what's going on in our own society today, which pit people, workers and middle classes, liberal elites and others, all mixed up, and conservative elites, against each other? Thinking about political values, I think, is really important. So we'll explore that further in the webinar as well, along with the importance of Germany's economic crisis. And then for the third question, I'd like you to think about political propaganda. What is propaganda? What actually does that word mean? And how did the Nazis appeal to voters? Right from the time that the Nazis were winning these votes, people were saying, wow, Nazi propaganda is different. But how was it different? And what was propaganda? And finally, the fourth question for you to think about, and that we'll be exploring in that October webinar. Elections in late Weimar Germany were accompanied by considerable political violence. What did the fight for the streets between the Nazis and the communists and the socialists do to contribute to the Nazi rise? Why was violence an important part of the Nazis' electoral strategy? So those are the four things that I want you to think about. I'm sure your teachers will give you some advice on what you'd like to read, what might be helpful for this. For my part, I've got a few books up on the screen that I recommend as well. Richard Evans' The Coming of the Third Reich is a really readable volume, really great narrative and analysis of why the Nazis rose. I'd also recommend Peter Flitzer's Germans into Nazis, which explains how the First World War set some of this rise up. I've put a couple of interesting online sources as well, which we can feed into our debates and discussions in October. So, that's the headline lecture. Why did Germans vote for the Nazi Party? We'll talk more about this in October, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what you come up with then. See you in October, 20th of October, Wednesday.